Welcome to TYT Interviews. We've got a doozy for you tonight. We've got Dick Morris in the studio, legendary political consultant in a lot of ways. Certainly helped the Clintons in the 1996 run, certainly against the Clintons in this run. In fact, he's written the book, Armageddon, How Trump Can Beat Hillary.
Actually, I worked for them, did Bill Clinton's first race for governor in 1978.
Yeah.
Then he lost, and then he fired me. Then he lost. Then he hired me back in 82. And I did him in 82, 84, 86, and 90.
Yeah, I want, look, there's some things we agree on. We're going to talk about that a little bit, and obviously things we massively disagree on. But I actually wanted to start with 1978, because you grew up in New York, and I know that you got into politics because you were helping a couple of classmates run, including Nadler, who's now a longtime Democratic congressman in New York. But how'd you get hooked up with Bill Clinton in Arkansas? How the hell did that happen?
I had done consulting for virtually every Democrat in New York State. I was very friendly with Bella Abzug and a bunch of others. And but then I decided to go national. So I called there was no such thing back then as a political consultant. And I kind of became it. And I called everybody who was running for senator or governor who was not an incumbent. And Bill was one of only two or three that saw me. The other was Ed King, who beat Dukakis in Massachusetts that year to be governor. And I flew out, and we had a 3-hour meeting scheduled for 10 minutes. And it was like the whole world opened up to him and suddenly became rational through polling and how you do it. But the highlight of the meeting was that at the end of it, I had to go to the bathroom. So he showed me to the bathroom in the AG's office, which was like a finished basement. And I closed the door behind me, and there was a floor-to-ceiling pinup of a blonde spilling out of a tiny white bikini. And I said, "Do you think this is okay? This is the Bible Belt?" He said, "Don't you know who that is?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't." And he said, "That's Dolly Parton." This was 78. And I said, "Who?" And he said, "Oh, man, you really are from New York."
Wow, that is amazing that you didn't know Dolly Parton, even in 78. And yeah, it might be the Bible Belt, but believe me, they're into blondes and bikinis. Okay, so now let's go on to your books, because there's one I really like the title to, and that's where we might find some agreements. But before I get to that, I'm going to read some of the titles of the books, and because today on the show we were talking about how conservatives live in a fear-based world. That's obviously our opinion, we're progressives. And as I read through the title of your books, outrage, catastrophe, revolt, screwed, Armageddon, it does seem to kind of have that
it
theme.
Does, of course. Well, actually, there's a progression. Outrage, fleeced, catastrophe, revolt, screwed, and Armageddon. And I think that's a pretty accurate trajectory of the feeling of the average person.
And certainly the average Republican voter who does feel screwed and has all this outrage. And I would say that the Republicans take advantage of that, but it depends on your framing. So let's go to what we agree on. So your book, Vote.com, How Big Money Lobbyists and the Media Are Losing Their Influence, and the Internet is Giving Power Back to the People. I mean, I could have almost written that title.
And I wrote it in 1999.
Okay. So now, but I'm curious as to your take of the Republican Party, because my argument would be, well, that's the Republican 101. They take lobbyist money, donor money, and they complain about crony capitalism, and they do crony capitalism.
Well, yeah, they do. Look, the whole thesis of what I'm going to talk about today, if you let me, is that there is a major split in the Democratic and the Republican parties, and that fundamentally the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and the Donald Trump, Ted Cruz wing, not the Bush wing, of the Republican Party have a great deal in common. And Ralph Nader, who was a good friend of my wife's, they founded NYPIRG together with Don Ross, says that his last book was called Convergence, about the left and the right converging. And that's what I believe. By the way, I also worked on the Brexit campaign, and that's another example of that. But take Vote.com. Everybody talks now about the Citizens United decision and all of that, and the influence of big money and so forth and so on. But 2 points are important. The first is that ultimately money is losing its power in politics. Donald Trump spent less than any of the major Republican candidates. Bernie Sanders outspent Hillary by 15 million in the primary. And ultimately, and I argue that Hillary's massive TV advantage over Donald, like 5-1, has not really helped her in the polling. During the period in which that ran in August, early September, Trump gained 10 points, closed a 10-point gap.
So my argument against that, go ahead,
wait a second, let
finish
me
up.
make it, is twofold. First of all, people are not watching television. So this narrow funnel that we all had to pass through, where they could catch us because we watched one of 3 shows,
Yes.
we're not there anymore.
Very true.
Secondly, there are totally inexpensive, free alternatives to it through the internet and through social media that are more effective. And finally, because of the pioneering work of Joe Trippi and Howard Dean, mass fundraising, which is now used by Trump, he has 100 million of that, have become so routinized and Americans so habituated to sending in small checks that they dwarf the big money. And finally, in the middle of a food fight, the big money is not very important. First of all, you can't use it on ads. And secondly, it's hard to reload. The reason Obama beat Hillary in 2008 was that she spent all of her money, which was raised conventionally from major donors, and then after on Super Tuesday, and then she was broke. And so was Obama. But Obama pushed send, and all the money came back in again through the internet. And Hillary had to make phone calls, her Rolodex, a new donor, a new meet and greet party, and it was a month before she was financially able to fight.
Yeah. So now I agree with you that the internet is clearly changing the way that we consume news. Obviously, I mean, we're the Young Turks. We're beating CNN online. It's a whole new world. And I agree with you that presidential politics has gotten to a really interesting point. Even though it's super ironically, we now have the 2 most hated candidates we've ever had in American history, I actually am encouraged overall because Bernie Sanders, with no name recognition, closed a 60-point lead on Hillary Clinton, which was unthinkable in any other era.
Yep.
And he did it through the raising money online and the popularity online, et cetera. And Trump is a populist, I think a fake populist, but a populist, and not an establishment candidate like Bush or Rubio. So those are the encouraging signs. Now, the reason why I do disagree with you about how money is less important now is that I think the presidential race is the exception because there's so much free media that goes into a presidential race. But if you're running a Senate race in Montana or a House of Representatives race in Connecticut, you are going to get swarmed with money.
Give it time. The same habits that break in at the presidential level filter down. And the main habit that's coming in is social media. That why would you buy television commercials when you can do a selfie on Facebook? My book, Armageddon. Fox won't have me on TV because they hate me because for some reason. CNN won't, and MSN because I'm too conservative. The networks won't because I'm too anti-Hillary. So with no television, I'm on the 10th week in the bestseller list. And the reason is social media. I do 2 or 3 selfies every single day. And
You're big on selfies.
I do 2 or 3 selfies every day, and I've had since July 20th 34 million views, page views. After Bill gave his speech at the convention about how great Hillary was in this highly edited biography, I gave the truth, and I have 12 million views, page views of that. So when you can do that, who needs paid media? Who has to pay attention to these guys? And the problem that the Kochs are having, and that all of the and Adelson, and all of these money types in both parties, and the unions too, is that their power has just gone away. It's Confederate currency, and it can still be used down ballot. You're right, but give it time. In 5 or 10 years, it won't be worth anything at all.
Well,
And I'm
I
very
hope
proud
you're right
that
about
20
that.
years ago, I predicted the end of money in politics in Vote.com.
Okay. Now, to be fair, though, you don't have a great track record on predictions.
Yeah, I do. In 2010, I predicted the Republicans would win 60 to 80 seats. I was the only guy that did that. In 2014, I predicted successfully every single Senate race. In 2012, I got it wrong, along with CNN and Gallup and Rasmussen. And the reason I did, and the reason they did, is there was a hurricane. and there could be no polling in the Northeast because the phone lines were down. And for 7 days, we were flying blind. And I think that Obama played that very well, and I think that with Christie's help, he turned that into a huge advantage.
Well, we've definitely begun our disagreements then. I think that all the polling indicated that Obama was going to win and win easily. That's why I predicted 6 weeks before the election that he would win. And so, and I didn't do that based on a gut sense.
I don't want to
polling.
accuse you of the same thing I accused Sean Hannity of. When he said Republicans are going to win, I said, yeah, you're like a clock that's right twice a day.
No. Believe me, I beat up on the Democratic Party all the time. Sure. I'm amazed any Democrat has ever won in the state of Florida because this Democratic Party in Florida is the most incompetent party I've ever seen.
Let's talk about the stuff we were talking about before the show.
Okay.
Because this is pretty good stuff.
Okay, so look, on the big money losing, from your mouth to God's ears, I hope that prediction is the one that's correct, okay, of the ones you've had. But I'm not going to wait around to see if it filters down to Montana. I believe that the right answer is an amendment to get money out of politics, because it is very hard for an unknown candidate in the middle of Montana to beat the Koch brothers when they come in, or Soros or whoever, right or
Actually,
left.
Montana, it's easier because the smaller the state, the less expensive the television.
So that's why I brought up a House race in Connecticut. I mean, you're going to try to buy TV ads in the New York metropolitan area. You're going to get swamped by the guy who has more money. But even in Montana, you can literally buy all the ads at a certain rate and shut the other guy out.
Yeah.
So then one guy has no voice at all.
Yeah.
And so that's completely unfair. That's not the free and fair elections we're supposed to have.
But that's unusual. But it is interesting that voters in the large northeastern metropolitan areas and LA are more educated and probably more intelligent than voters in the small states. But voters in the small states are so much better informed because their news stations cover politics. And they're accustomed to seeing their congressman on TV several times a week. Most people in LA or in New York couldn't recognize him if they fell over him. But I believe, Cenk, that there is a massive change taking place in party politics in America. Ralph Nader calls it the convergence. And that's what I think is the case.
Let's talk about the Republican side of that.
Left and the right are increasingly coming together on a shared agenda.
So I'm
opposing the establishment.
It's amazing how much we agree on that. Okay, so and I do. And I run a nonpartisan PAC called Wolf PAC to get money out of politics, to get that amendment. And Republicans support us all the time. We win sometimes unanimous decisions in state houses. Republicans and Democrats are voting for us. One of the most conservative Republicans in Texas introduced our resolution. So I see that on the ground floor, no question about it. I'm encouraged by a lot of the Republican voters who also hate the money in politics, who don't want the unions, who don't want Bloomberg, but also don't want Rove or the Koch brothers telling them who to vote for. That is great. It is real. 90% of the country agrees with us. I think we're going to win on that. But the trouble I run into is...
You're never going to pass a constitutional amendment
amending
the First Amendment.
Might be another wrong prediction on your part, but let's see. But the problem we have is Republican politicians. So in some places, no, wonderful. Like I said, at the state level, they want election reform. They might not agree with us on all the strategy. So we go to a convention, and they're going to have a different proposal for how to fix the money in politics problem or the election reform issues, right? But at the national level, and it's not like the Democrats are that much better, but at the national level, it's nearly impossible to support any of these Republican politicians who turn around and give giant tax breaks and subsidies. Why does the oil industry, the most profitable industry in the world, need $14 to $40 billion in our subsidies?
Absolutely. And any energy industry that needs subsidies can't make it in the market, and they shouldn't be subsidized. Look, I believe fully in that, and I think that there is a huge split in the Republican Party between Main Street and Wall Street. You all Democrats write about the anti-Mitch McConnell, anti-Boehner, increasingly anti-Ryan, and then you saw in the Republican electorate how Bush and Kasich and Rubio got no votes, and Christie and Cruz and Trump ran the table and then fought against each other, but still together they got 3/4 of the vote. And that's because there is this fundamental disjuncture. And take the issue of income inequality, which is the seminal issue, I think, of the left. First, I believe in it strongly, and I think many Republicans do. And I think that we believe, or our wing of the party believes, that it's caused deliberately by the wealthy to maximize their power. So, for example, when we critique free trade agreements, NAFTA and that stuff, I see that as the upward redistribution of wealth within the United States by ricochet or foreign trade. In other words, they outsource jobs to China, but half of Chinese exports are from American and European-owned companies, and 2/3 of the tech exports are that. So they outsource the work. The small workers make a little bit of money, but the profits are huge to the stockholders and the management class, who all live in the United States, and it's a way of upward redistribution within the U.S.
Okay, I'm getting kind of weirded out by how much we agree so far.
In the same sense that oil prices used to be that, because I'm not going to buy a jet fighter, but Saudi Arabia is, so take it from me at the pump and then get it back. I also believe that immigration is the leading cause of income inequality, because I go with Abe Lincoln on this. Lincoln grew up in a subsistence farm, and he knew that it was a trap. He couldn't escape it. And he got a job as a riverboat captain in the Mississippi, and he got a cash wage. And he saw that as the liberation, the chance to get away from what Jefferson extolled as the yeoman farmer, but we know was a dirt-poor subsistence farmer who couldn't do anything. And Lincoln came in and said, yeah, Mr. Jefferson, you had a nail factory and you hired your slaves to do that for free. So how could a worker make a wage? And he said, if there are 5 million people who can be forced to work for nothing, wages won't ever be an upward mobility. I believe that if you have 13 million people in the United States who are willing to work at a global level, which is almost nothing, the working class has no opportunity to move up through the wage system. And when the opponents of immigration reform say, we don't want to do those jobs, landscaping, hospitality, construction, nonsense. A majority of those jobs are performed now by American citizens. What we don't want is to do it for nothing because of the way wages are depressed. Finally, I think, let me just lay it out. I think the third element is quantitative easing, which was a deliberate effort by the Fed to wallpaper Wall Street with money. The theory was that they would then lend it out. But Obama knew damn well they weren't going to lend it out. The economy was too bad. Regulations were too tough. How could you lend it out in the healthcare industry when you don't know what healthcare rules are going to be? And as a result, and they all knew that those firms would keep the money. And the key was that in October of 2012, I think, 11, the Fed paid interest on it. So these guys get money from the Fed, giving them worthless bonds in return. And they park it at the Fed. They don't use it to stimulate the economy. And the Fed is paying them interest.
Yeah. No, again, it's strange
and that's
how much...
where all of Wall Street's money comes from.
It's strange how much we're agreeing. We have to get back to disagreeing.
No, but let's
no, but okay,
let's just spend a minute exploring it, because
I'm kidding.
It's so important.
Yeah,
that we all realize that.
So let me explain the parts that I agree with you and then disagree. So quantitative easing, all these things that they say is to help the economy is an excuse. No, it's the powerful that are redirecting federal resources to their benefit. And that's because of money in politics. They can just basically legalize bribery.
The average employee on Wall Street, and that includes the cleaning lady, makes $500,000 a year counting bonuses.
No, and quantitative easing, yeah, I'd make a lot of money too if you gave me money for free, which is exactly what the Fed does. And then, but they say the only way you can qualify is if you're a giant enough bank. So even if you're a small business or and yet there are such things as hardworking, responsible banks, you're not allowed to get it. Only the richest can get quantitative easing.
Absolutely.
It's just
and by the way, it is. And here I'm forgive me if there's a little anti-Obama bias in it. Socially, I believe that basically, when you get down to it, what the establishment of the Democratic Party wants is a corporatist state, which is vertically integrated, just like, I mean, it's fascist, but it's not racist. But it's the idea of the and all the banks, the consumers, the government, and the regulators all get together at a card table and divvy it up. And to do that, you need a few large banks to dominate, and you can't have 1,000 community banks running off in different ways. So a big part of quantitative easing and a big part of the Fed's cracking down on lending for small banks that didn't cause any of this garbage in 2007 is to eliminate them. And when Obama took office, there were about 1,100 community banks. Now there are between 600 and 700.
Okay,
And
so
whittling that away is a key part of this massive capital agenda.
okay, there we disagree. So, and I'll tell you why. So I understand what you're saying. When you used to use the word fascism, combination of the state and government, I'm sorry, the state and business.
Statism is the best way to call it.
Is, and I'm concerned about that development. But it's not a democratic agenda to put together this thing. It is the natural outgrowth of saying, okay, well, now we will have a system where the rich can donate as much money as they want to politicians. So they will logically buy as many politicians as they can to fix the rules on their behalf. Any rational person would, and certainly any rational corporation would. So that's why you get a situation where state and business are merging, which some call fascism, helped by, yes, the Republican Party, but yes, large portions of the Democratic Party. And it's Obama that did
quantitative. Let's not call it
quantitative.
fascism, because that has too much of a
Yeah, it has ramifications.
Mussolini
I hear you.
connotation.
Yeah, it has historical ramifications. But yes, the merging of state and business.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's not supposed to do that. That's not what America is supposed to be.
Right.
So we agree on that. But it's just sometimes I feel that the Republicans get too conspiratorial when the conspiracy is wide open. It's out in the open. It's no, I get to give you unlimited campaign money. That's the conspiracy. It's not like that.
Now-
Progressives
now
have
let
this
me-
image of like we want the government to control everything. That's,
let me
I've
inject.
never heard a progressive say that.
Let me inject another thought. I worked for UKIP, for Brexit, because I believe that ultimately the whole effort is to transfer the locus of decision-making to international bodies, over half of whom are not democratic, represent nobody. Who does China represent, the vote? Who does Putin represent? Those people. And make that the decision maker. Let me give you a great example that I think will appeal to your listeners. We had a big problem 3 or 4 years ago with dolphins, flipper, being extinct. And the reason was that the tuna nets were acres wide, square miles, and they scoop up everything there. And the dolphins couldn't escape the tuna nets and were inadvertently killed. And by the time they got to them and freed them, they were dead. So how do you solve that? Well, a bunch of scientists invented a net that the dolphin could escape from, but the tuna couldn't. How do you get the fishing fleets to use it? Well, without government action, a lot of environmental groups and wildlife groups went to the tuna companies and said, why don't you put dolphin safe on your can of tuna? And that'll certify that you're getting it from this net. And it worked incredibly. Everybody has it. If you go home and check your tuna, you'll see that on it. And dolphin population revived. Then last year, the damn World Trade Organization came in on a lawsuit from Mexico and said that was an unfair trade practice by the United States, discriminating against countries that couldn't afford the new nets. And the result was that they banned it. And in 6 months, you will not find tuna safe on any can. This global regimen, and just one other thought on that. When the Irish and Italian immigrants took over cities, the WASP power structure moved the locus of decision-making to state government. Then, when the racists took over state government, the radical Republicans moved it to the national government. Now that the national governments are unduly reflective of public opinion and unduly reflective of the resentment that impelled both the Sanders and the Trump candidacy and Brexit, they want to move it to the United Nations, to an international body. And the big problem is that that while capitalism is global, democracy is not. And therefore, the view of the people in being able to speak out against this is attenuated by the lack of those institutions.
So you almost had me. I thought you were going to end the sentence with, and I agree with you on how they moved it up, that they're now moving it to multinational corporations that are actually running
Absolutely.
things. Okay, so
And
we
they-
do agree on that.
And they work with
Okay.
the bureaucracies that run these organizations at the behest of the multinationals, with a revolving door of employment, are not different from the aristocracies that ran feudal Europe. And it's the same deal. Europe has never really been sold on democracy. And I think that the real risk here is that ultimately the UN and the IMF and the international bodies, who are the bureaucratic stand-ins for the multinational corporations, take it all over and preempt the democratic resolution of this stuff.
So that's exactly why I'm opposed to TPP. I don't have anything against free trade. I think trade makes the world go around. I want more countries to trade and with as little tariffs as possible. But I'm not willing to give away our local sovereignty to do that. I don't want multinational corporations deciding that we're not going to have.
And TPP has nothing to do with trade. 80% of the exports under TPP are already free trade. They're Canada and Mexico. They're part of NAFTA. And much more is part of Japan that's bilaterally regulated. Trade is the excuse. What they want is global governance. So
that's where I think we have a slight disagreement.
They can block GMO labeling.
Yeah.
They can deal with my tuna. They can deal with that stuff.
So I just think that we have a slight disagreement there. Well, maybe an important disagreement, because I don't think the United Nations is the boogeyman. Now, if you say IMF, and so that is actually controlled by the big banks and tied to the corporations.
G20.
Okay, that's fair, because that's where the
UN is a slogan of that. It's
the
really
UN
G20.
is actually a group that does, I think, a lot of great things, UNICEF, peacekeeping, et cetera, and doesn't really have any real power.
Right.
And so I want the world to work together. I don't mind that part. I think that part is wonderful. I just don't want it to be co-opted by people for their own interests, and I think that's what's happening here.
Now, TPP is the peak of the iceberg. The real problem is TISA, which is coming behind it. TISA is being negotiated in secret. WikiLeaks published a draft treaty 2 months ago. And it is the Trade in Services Agreement. The only refuge that American workers have is that when we get put out of manufacturing jobs, we can try to get service sector jobs. TISA would subject our service sector workers to the same global wage that our manufacturing workers are subject to, because it would provide that any corporation could move its employees from one country to the other without regard to immigration laws. So that Sheraton could move all of its hotel workers worldwide to the United States and displace all the American workers. And many of them would not have to be paid the minimum wage.
So we certainly have some disagreements on immigration as well. I understand what you're saying about keeping wages suppressed, and at the same time, maybe we do agree. I mean, we certainly, it's the corporations that want those lower wages. That's why we haven't fixed immigration all this time.
I always believe that the Republican Party wants immigrants to work but not vote, and the Democratic Party wants them to vote but not work.
Well, because of the unions,
yeah.
Right? I understand. But I think immigration reform, where they have a pathway to citizenship, is more than fair, because then you have to at least have it not be off the books and artificially depressed wages. Then you can still have them get the same wages and have a reasonable system. 14 years, which was the latest reform, that's twice as long as indentured servitude.
The concern I would have on that, and here I do accept the Republican line, is not the current illegal immigrants, but the whole next wave. And what we learned from the Obama amnesty thing with Central America showing up on our doorstep is that, this is a world of 7 billion people, most of whom would like to live in the United States.
No, there has to be a process. I'm a legal immigrant. My parents did it, quote unquote, the right way, but we're lucky. My uncle was a doctor. They needed doctors, and that's how we first came in.
Also, the right way. Come on, my grandparents were illegal immigrants from Austro-Hungary, but there was no immigration law. The first immigration law was 1926.
Yeah. Well, the original undocumented immigrant was Christopher Columbus. But I think that there is a way to set up a fair system that if people work really hard for a long time, and they get to be American citizens. That's this country's built on immigrants. Okay, so but what I can't understand, if we agree on all this, is why you're backing Trump. So first, you sound like a Bernie Sanders supporter.
For the same reason Bernie Sanders opposed Hillary. Actually, in my case, it's even more, because when I knew the Clintons, they were not corrupt. They wanted money in order to get power. Give me campaign contributions and I'll rule. Now I believe they want power to make money. I believe it's not even that I want to do public policy stuff. It's that, the going price for a Secretary of State is better than a candidate, and the going price for a president is better than a Secretary of State.
Okay, let me stop you there, because that's a thing I've always been curious about. Now, I fought against Hillary Clinton throughout the entire primaries. I understand the systemic corruption in all of our politicians, and Hillary Clinton, having been a politician for a long time, is a big example of that. I don't think she's particularly evil. I think that she is a part of that system.
But she is unique.
Okay, so that's what I want to ask you about. They already have $150 million in personal wealth. Do you really think that it's getting to $200 million that's driving them?
Look at what she's risked. I mean, she had the whole private email thing so that nobody would find out. And the whole thing, I mean, look at the infamy that she's risked. She could coast into the presidency if she didn't have the Clinton Foundation and didn't have the secret emails. Trump wouldn't have a prayer. The whole campaign is based on it. She damn near lost the nomination over it. And there's another point that you, as an expert on campaign finance, can well appreciate. Under the campaign finance laws, when you get a contribution, you can't use it for anything good. You can buy TV ads, you can print literature, you can hire staff. But you can't buy lunch, you can't buy a vacation house, you can't pay for your retirement, you can't pay for a fancy dwelling. And but with speaking fees, you can. And $238 million, 30 of it is book income, that's fine. But I like book income. But
I can tell from all the books you wrote. Yeah.
But $200 million of speaking fees, that is bribery. And it's bribery far more than a campaign contribution. Many politicians have gone to jail for trying to use campaign money for personal money. The Clintons solved that problem by the foundation and the speaking fee. And what disturbs me is that she's not promising to close that damn foundation, or for Bill not to accept speaking fees.
So, okay, you're not going to, surprise me with anything that the Clintons have done that I'm going to agree with you. Like, so I don't agree that they're particularly evil. I just think they're part of the system, and I think that they did the foundation has done good work, but yet at the same time did settle off those uranium mines. Yes, they got huge speaking fees.
The foundation is like a patina to protect a gigantic bribery operation. And when people say, what did they get? What was the quid pro quo? That misunderstands international finance. You go into a third world country and you say, oh, and lunch I had yesterday with the Secretary of State, she said, at that point, take your pick, man. You want to own our cable system? You want the highway contracts? You want to take care of the university system? You want to get cable TV? You make any money you want.
But they would have paid Bill Clinton for those speeches anyway. Why?
Not $1 million.
Sure they would have. He's Bill Clinton. No, you're right about the overall thing. If you get to hang a picture with Bill Clinton in your office in Kazakhstan, you're going to make a lot of money. So that $1 million investment is worth it. Why do they also have to give $30 million to the foundation? And how does that help the Clintons? And they do use that for some good stuff. I'm not defending the foundation overall, but
first of all, Bill lives in Little Rock largely in that penthouse apartment. During the whole period of Hillary's out-of-office period, her first race, 8 years Senate has no payroll really, no patronage. And now with this race, her whole staff, the whole operation, was kept on ice in the Clinton Foundation.
Okay, that makes sense. See, and I've heard Democrats
say
that.
And travel, global travel. And I think that, and plus the fact that the foundation's assets can be controlled by the Clintons, and we won't know until we're both 70, until I'm 80 and you're 60, what they're going to do with that money eventually.
Well, they do spend it. So I don't have problems with what they do with the foundation money. I do have problems with if they're housing their entire political staff there, but most importantly, if they're returning favors. And it appears on the face of it that they did return favors.
Listen, I have a great story that I love to tell. It's apocryphal, but in 1960, this guy gave John Kennedy $1 million. And Kennedy said, "Oh, wow, thank you, great contribution. What can I do for you?" I said, "Nothing, Jack, just get nominated." And then he got nominated, and, well, I have the nomination, what can I, just win the election. And then after he won the election, I have the whole cabinet, I haven't named any ambassadorship, what do you want? He said, "Just take power, I don't want anything, and I'll let you know." And then he took office, and in March or April, after 2 months or 3 months, the guy called Kennedy and said, "I'd like a favor from you." He said, "Anything. I mean, I've given away all the good jobs, but whatever I can do for you." And he said, "Well, I'd like to have lunch with you 2 weeks from Tuesday at Sans Souci, the fashionable restaurant in Washington, at 1 o'clock." And he said, "Well, I'll have you at the White House mess." And he said, No, I'd rather Sans Souci." So the guy rents out the restaurant, gets all of his clients, all of his friends, every person he's ever known, all his business associates, all his prospects. And they're all in the room, and Kennedy comes walking in, and he says, "Not now, Jack, I'm busy."
Okay, so it is a apocryphal story, but it gets the point across, yes. So, and that is why people give so much money to the Clinton Foundation. I was amused, somebody said, well, if Saudi Arabia cares so much about giving to the needy, they could just give without the Clinton Foundation. They give it to another foundation. Sure. There's some chance they care about giving to the Clintons, to themselves, to those guys specifically. Okay, now having said that, how about the Trump Foundation? Jesus Christ, I mean, it looks like one giant scam.
Yeah, but he had no public influence to sell.
Okay, but how do you get behind a guy that you know runs one scam after another after another? I mean, he buys a 20-foot picture of himself.
I'm not Donald Trump, and I'm not going to defend him in everything. Some of what he's done is not good, is terrible, looks awful, but he did not have public influence to sell.
But he was the opposite, Dick, and that is why...
He was a buyer.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I've been saying on the show. Hillary Clinton might be the corrupted, but Donald Trump is the corrupter. And that's why they were at that wedding together, Donald Trump's wedding, because that's how this game is played. Yep. My favorite example is he gives $45,000 to Alan Hevesi, who's a New York Democrat.
Yeah, right.
Okay? And he needs a tax loophole.
Yeah.
Hevesi gives it to him. He makes, I think he made about $150 million from that tax loophole.
Hevesi went to jail.
Yeah.
I think he did.
He did. Not for the Trump deal, but for the next deal that he did.
The important thing, I think, to focus on in this is that we have never had a personally corrupt president. Richard Nixon was corrupt, but he died relatively low middle income, no great estate there. Warren G. Harding was totally corrupt, but he committed suicide, and he was not wealthy. His administration was. Grants, people made out like gangbusters, but he had to write his memoirs to have enough money for Julia to live after his death. Mm-hmm. And we are now about to have, conceivably, a personally corrupt president. And when you look at the magnitude of what there is to sell in this country, and you look at their avarice in doing it, you say, as a defense of them, that they have 150 million, why do they need to steal? When you steal, when you have 150 million, it means you are a kleptomaniac. It means it's not something you can control.
Okay, I hear you, but I would then counter with the same exact thought about Donald Trump. I mean, here's a guy who claims that he's a billionaire and is running a two-bit scam like Trump University, taking $10,000 at a time, $35,000 if he gets lucky. I mean, no billionaire runs a scam like that, but even if he's not a billionaire, he's still got several $100 million, and he's still running scams like that. I mean, you want to talk about avarice. So, look, to me, is Hillary Clinton the answer? Of course not, right? So she is the establishment. That's why I fought against her in the primaries. That's why I'll fight against her starting on day one, okay? But if you say to me, choose between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, well, I know Donald Trump's a crook, okay? So I know that Hillary Clinton has been corrupted by the system. I don't know that, I don't necessarily agree with you that...
Hillary has led the way in this.
Okay.
Name one other politician that has collected anything approaching $238 million in speaking fees after their presidency.
Oh, the degree to which Donald Trump would do that if he could is indescribable. Okay.
What's that got to do with it?
So, no, it has everything to do with it because Trump, it might be doing favors for Russia because Russia lent him money because no U.S. bank would. That is dangerous. So even if we were to call it a tie on corruption, okay, then Trump, on top of that, adds bigotry. And more important than that, two other things. Ineptitude and he's a wild card in not understanding our way of government, right? So when he says, oh, well, I'll just ban the press. No, you can't just ban the press. I can't take a risk like that. Yeah. And so he says, oh, we'll just kill the terrorist families. But you don't know which, you're calling them terrorists, right? I mean, you can't, even if you are positive they're terrorists, you can't kill their families. That's not what we do as Americans. So on top of the corruption, when you add the bigotry, the violations of the Constitution he seems to not care about at all, and his giant incompetence, well, that breaks the tie.
Well, I don't think you can accuse someone of incompetence who's amassed an empire like that.
I most certainly can.
I mean, incompetence.
I do a whole series called Loser Donald.
Incompetence died bankrupt.
He went bankrupt 6 times.
I know, yeah, but incompetence died that way. Competent people and good businessmen figured their way out.
Well, I mean, if you keep stiffing every single person you've ever done business with, I guess that's a way out.
Let's talk public policy a little bit about that, because those are the real differences between Hillary and Bill, Hillary and Trump. When Reagan took office, 1/3 of our federal budget was entitlement payments. Now 2/3 is. When Obama took office, the total number of people on either Medicaid or food stamps or Section 8 housing, not Medicare or Social Security, but welfare means-tested programs, was 76 million. Under Obama, it's risen to 107 million. And the number of adults who worked full-time was 137 million, and it's dropped to 114. And you have roughly 15 to 20 million people who have left the labor force. And I'm very concerned that we're headed toward a country where nobody works. And I believe that that is the problem we face with globalist economics. Because I think that right now, the third world countries are subsidized because of the massive trade that goes on. You want an iPhone, you get 9 countries to make component parts with dirt cheap workers, and you assemble it a 10th and sell it in an 11th. Robots are increasingly capable of doing that. And I believe in 10 or 15 years, there will not be a single manufacturing job, except for 1%. It'll go the way of farming.
So,
and now they're expanding that to the service sector.
Yeah, no, I understand the trend that's coming with robots. We agree on that. But we do not agree on the forces that are causing what you call entitlement spending and the increase in welfare and food stamps, et cetera. So first of all, entitlement is something you are entitled to because you paid into it. Social Security and Medicare are the most popular programs in America for a reason. So those being a big part of the budget, I have no problem with at all. I would much rather have that be a big part of the budget that we paid into and then we get back than spending my money on tax loopholes and subsidies and wars.
You pay for pay for about half of Social Security, and then for yourself, and then investment income pays for another quarter, and the final quarter is from current workers, just to rob Peter to pay Paul.
But it's not rob Peter to pay Paul. It depends. Then we're going to get into a demographic argument. So, but bottom line is that the overwhelming majority of that is money that you are getting back, and at least that is a function of government that I could live with. Much better than wasting $1.5 trillion in Iraq and causing ISIS and all
By the
that.
way, that's another area of convergence: the withdrawal from the imperialist world, the withdrawal from the perpetual war. And a more limited national interest about going to war. That's an absolutely fundamental point of convergence between the left and the right against the center, because the center, the elites, make a lot of money from war, and war permits them to distort the whole federal budget and make it an upward redistribution of income.
But I thought the last time we fought, which was about a decade ago, was because of that you were supporting the Iraq War. So what happened on that?
I was wrong.
Oh, okay. All right, great.
I screwed up.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that you had come around on that.
No,
Terrific.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I was against the Libya war and the Syria war, and I just think that the whole notion of American intervention has gotten completely crazy. And I support a lot of what Trump is talking about in that connection, about limiting the foreign commitments and making it less dependent on American largesse. But you ask me why I'm supporting Trump, and the answer is because he's running against Hillary. Now, Bernie Sanders, I think, created a brand new agenda for the American left, and I think that was great. But I think what impelled a lot of his candidacy was anti-Hillary. Let me raise another topic with you. College. When I worked for Clinton, we passed a program that is still in effect that we advertised as free community college. And it was a tax credit that paid for the 13th and 14th year of education and was keyed to the average tuition at state universities for community colleges. What happened was the legislature thanked us, swallowed the money, cut back the appropriations, tuitions went up, and it's no longer free. I believe that the solution to that is not increased subsidy. The solution to that is for the government to insist on better administration of finances at the university level. Make professors work 12 hours a week, not 6. Hold administrative costs to 10% of the budget, not 30 or 40. Don't pay presidents of state universities $1 million a year, and rein in those costs. We are indebting an entire generation of Americans, and it's killing our economy because they can't afford to buy anything. The reason Japan is in economic stagnation is because of the size of their apartments and their ability to do stuff. There's no domestic demand. We're doing that by indebting this generation.
Yep, that's right. And it's
I
killing
think that the key is
it's killing the economy and the middle class and jobs
and families.
Yeah.
And the key is not to chase our tail around with greater subsidies or loan forgiveness. The key is to make them stop increasing the cost of college. You should have a list of economic requirements, and any university that doesn't meet those, public university, does not get student loans, Pell Grants, or any of that.
So again, we might disagree on some of the details there, but I understand where you're going with it. And on food stamps, just real quick, it's partly because Walmart doesn't pay their employees anything.
Yeah.
So then they need food stamps to
One
live.
of the things that really bugs me is the corruption in the EITC program, Earned Income Tax Credit. I love the Earned Income Tax Credit program. I worked very hard on welfare reform, on expanding it. And our whole concept was that if you go to work, you don't come home poor. And but because there is so much corruption in its administration, about a third of the payments are illegitimate. They don't fund it to the extent it needs to be funded. When you say raise the minimum wage, you have to do that now, but you have to do it because the EITC doesn't work. You shouldn't have to go to McDonald's, to a businessman and say, pay your workers X as opposed to Y, which the market would be. Pay them Y, and the government will give them the Earned Income Tax Credit difference. But because of the terrible administration of that program, it's acquired a horrible reputation, and therefore people don't invest in it. But when you drill down, I want to raise one other question with you. Global warming, climate change. Happening, human fault.
Yes.
I believe the answer to that is natural gas. Half the carbon content of coal. Already, because of the price differential, the percent of electric power that comes from coal has dropped from 54% to 41% and is dropping every day. And I think that that is the huge step in that direction.
So
Obama takes the position, though, that this is just a less sin, and he wants renewables, even though you can't make the case that it works economically at this point.
Okay, so let me address that real quick, but we are going to at some point run out of time. So I do want to I want to conclude the Trump conversation. Then before we go, I got to ask you about your personal interactions with the Clintons and what you think of Bill Clinton. So, but let's do all of it one at a time. Real quick on fracking. Look, I thought the jury was out on that, and some progressives were mad at me for saying the jury's out. But the jury's starting to come in. The release of methane gases are terrible for global warming and climate change. And
That's more black sands than fracking.
No, it happens in fracking as well. And I'm not the ultimate expert on it. But more studies are coming in. We just reported on one a couple of weeks ago where people in areas where there's fracking have more migraine headaches, more nausea, more ailments, and they did it blind. They figured out where they had the most ailments and then looked at a map and realized, oh, that's where they're fracking.
Well, it's got to be better regulated. The reason that they used to be called acid rain was that they put the water from the fracking in open containers that evaporated and came down in rain. It needs to be better regulated, but fracking is the anti-terror instrument of our time. You think terrorism is dividing the world. You think it's creating a demographic backlash. It's stigmatizing certain ethnic groups. I agree with all of that. Fracking, which disempowers oil. There's no problem in the world that is not caused by black or white, oil or cocaine. And if you can frack your way to a point where oil becomes cheap as hell, which it's about to be, the whole basis of these totalitarian, authoritarian regimes gets cut out from under them.
I would just ask you to go one step further and go to renewable energy, which I think is
if
the
you
better
can.
answer. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to finish the Trump conversation, look, I don't, on him not understanding the U.S. Constitution alone, I can't go for him. And so is it a fair thing to say that, look, the establishment played a mean trick on us this time, okay? They wound up beating Bernie Sanders, and then they put a guy that I think you can't vote for all the reasons that I listed. Okay, so this time we make sure we don't fall into the abyss with Trump, and then we turn around and fight the establishment and beat him the next time. So the reason I view him as the abyss is for all the reasons I stated.
Constitutional overreach. I mean,
yes.
Come on. Obama took a 1970 law that was meant for personal health and used it to fight carbon dioxide that we breathe every day that has nothing to do with health, and through a whole power of his executive orders that he earlier felt he could only do legislatively, he's totally changing the American economy. That's overreach if you ever saw it.
So again, we would disagree on the details there, but if you're worried about that and you're worried about executive branch power, and in a lot of ways I am, especially in how we go to war these days, and I think you now agree, Trump says, I don't care what the generals say. I don't care what anybody says. And when I'm in charge, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to shut them up, and I'm going to do that. Doesn't that give you a lot of pause and a lot of concern?
It does. Absolutely does. And, I think of John Kennedy against the steel mills when they raised the price of steel and they sicked the FBI on them and wiretapped them. And I look at the NSA. But I got to tell you, on the other hand, we're getting now into the other personal area of my relationship with them. Do you want a woman who hired a fleet of private detectives to investigate the women her husband was involved with, to dig up dirt on them, to compromise them, to blackmail them, 20 or 30 of them, and did it not to get a divorce, not to tell him to stop, but to let him be president? Do you want her controlling the NSA, the FBI, the CIA? There is nothing about Hillary's treatment of Bill's women that reminds me so much of J. Edgar Hoover. And the whole church committee effort to move us away from that could now be completely reversed, because Hillary has a Nixonian sense of enemies list. It's not just that she's corrupt, that's part of it, but she's Nixonian, obsessive, compulsive, and ruthless.
Yeah, so that part I cannot attest to. I don't know it, and I can't say to the audience that you're right about that. That's your perspective, etc. I do know what the one thing we have talked about on the show is that what they said about Monica Lewinsky was unconscionable.
Yeah.
Because if you did it, you slept with the intern. And I get him lying about it in the first place. I would have lied about it in the first place.
I was the only one he told the truth to. He told me, I've testified in the grand jury to this, when I got here to the White House, I had to shut my body down sexually, and I screwed up with this girl. I didn't do what they said I did, but I may have done so much that I couldn't prove my innocence. It was 6 months later on the Hannity show that I finally realized what the hell he meant. But it isn't just Monica. Take Linda Tripp, who helped Monica get out. She got transferred to the Defense Department. Okay, then her personnel file got leaked to Jane Mayer at New Yorker magazine and got published, shoplifting and other arrests as a kid. She sued for an invasion of her privacy and collected $500,000 from the government.
Yeah.
That file ended there because Hillary wanted it to end there.
So, as I was going to say, the attacks against Monica Lewinsky when you know you slept with her was wrong, was definitely wrong. Now, Linda Tripp, in my opinion, was a bit of a vile character, but that doesn't make it right to leak her records. And it's funny how if a whistleblower leaks anything, they're permanently banished to Russia or they're in jail like Chelsea Manning for decades. But if the government wants to leak things that is, to its own advantage, they leak away.
That's right.
And no one ever goes to jail. So finally on to Bill Clinton. Do you think he's conservative? So, you in this regard, you know him a little bit better. And everybody's always guessing. Is he really a progressive and he's just trying to pull there in a slow way in that direction? Or in his core, is he a little bit conservative?
Bill,
or maybe a lot?
First of all, the Bill Clinton we're dealing with now is not the Bill Clinton I worked for 20 years ago. He's weak, he's feeble, enfeebled, and one look at him or 5 minutes with him, which I had 10 years ago, shook hands with me, and it was like, ugh. I had to hold him up practically. This is not the energetic, vibrant Bill Clinton I worked with, and I think that he is not capable of this kind of the same level of thought as he had before. From the Bill Clinton of the 1990s, I believe that Bill was a moderate and a liberal when he had to be, and Hillary was a liberal and a moderate when she had to be.
So who do you think they actually are, like politically?
Do you watch House of Cards?
Yes.
Claire Underwood. Mm-hmm. Without the sex.
Okay, well, again, I don't want to get into that. But so you think, no, it's just for personal gain. And so ideology is just a matter of convenience.
Right now. Because Hillary reversed everything and will reverse everything. Anybody who believes anything she says about what she's going to do is wrong. She'll do what the polling says she should do and what the play of congressional entitlement and work says she could do. As far as Bill is concerned, when he was president, he did not have ideological moorings, but he certainly had objectives, and he achieved them all. He would have said, my goal is to balance the budget. He did. My goal is to bring unemployment down to a 4% level. He did. My goal is to adjust the U.S. to compete and win in the global economy. He did. My goal is to reform welfare and cut the welfare entitlements in half and cut the poverty rate by a third. He did. And I kept telling people when I was working with him that that's the way he thinks. That's the way he has goals. Not my goal is social justice and equality and all that. His goals were primarily statistical, primarily outcome-driven, and he was brilliant at the way he achieved it. Welfare reform was so brilliant. I always use the metaphor of tacking. The wind blows one way, so he doesn't go against it, but he doesn't go the way it goes, because that's a demagogue. He goes as close to where he wants to go, and then he comes about and goes the other way. So when he had a Democratic Congress, he expands earned income tax credit, expands daycare subsidies, expands job training. Then when he gets a Republican Congress, he puts in entitlement reform and time limits. And you put them together, and it worked brilliantly.
I think that's actually a fair description of how they catch the wind. And they are classic politicians. So the book is Armageddon, How Trump Can Beat Hillary. And as I say that title, I realize I do have to ask you one more question. Who do you think is going to win?
You're not getting me into that one. But I will say, just to people who are considering whether to get the book, the key element in it is that it breaks the new ground we were talking about in this discussion. I don't think there has ever been, in recent months, on television, a discussion like the one we've just had, and the ground we plowed and the ground we explored and looked at. And in fact, we could take it and use it as a governing philosophy. And I think that is unique, that is new, and that's really the guts of the book.
Okay, I have to say that I'm not sure I've ever been as surprised at an interview as this. And about a decade ago, you walked out on us, and here we've had surprising amount of agreement. Thank you, Dick Morris. We appreciate it.
Thank you. By the way, when I walked out on you, as I look back on, I don't think I did. I think I had another appointment. But in any case, as I look back on it, and I now judge that, my substantive contentions were 70% wrong and 30% right, and yours were the reverse.
Again, thank you for that admission. Look, that goes towards open-mindedness, no matter who's right about any particular issue.
One of the problems in politics is we never concede when we're wrong.
Yep.
So we have no statutory body of decided things. everybody still has their own version of what happened. And we can't look at events and say this event means this is the right course and that was the wrong course. Iraq is the exception where it's so obvious.
Yes, and it turns out if you have a real conversation, you might find a lot of agreement.
Yeah.
So that's what we try to do here. All right, thank
Good.
you again.
Thank you. I'm so glad I did this.